Neil Armstrong is a pilot who accidentally gets out of the atmosphere during the test of one of the jets, but in the end he is able to reach the ground safely. Considering that he has made such mistakes several times, this makes him banned from piloting. On the other hand, his daughter Karen's condition is getting worse day by day because of the cancerous tumor in her head. Neil's friend Joseph comes to him and tells him that they are looking for pilots who are also trained in flight engineering for the Gemini project, but Neil tells him that Karen's situation is more important to him and he shouldn't be shifted. But in the end, Karen can't cope with her illness and dies. This incident is extremely sad for Neil and his wife Janet. He can't get to his job for a while, but eventually he returns to work and there he finds out that he was fired as a pilot and he has to write a report on his last flight for them. When he goes to his office, he sees the news about the Gemini project again. For this reason, he goes to the astronaut selection event at Ellington Air Base. In 1962, he met Elliot C., who had also come there to be recruited. After a good selection, he managed to be added to the Gemini project. Houston, the Gemini project focuses on traveling to the moon and tries to defeat them in competition with the Russian Space Agency, which has recently had many successes by completing this project. This project and the idea that NASA has to reach the moon, it's in this way that they will move towards the moon with a spacecraft, then the spacecraft carrying the astronauts will separate from the mother spacecraft and land on the moon, then after the astronauts return from the surface of the moon, they will connect to the mother spacecraft and return to the Earth. According to NASA, with this method can reach the surface of the moon and then return safely from there. The Gemini project is for testing. The first stage is connecting the spacecrafts to each other, and if they succeed in this stage, they will enter the main project, Apollo, which will take them to the moon. In 1964, the people who were accepted in the selection began to go through the experimental stages of being in space. These extremely hard exercises are placed next to the theoretical topics that must be fully mastered. Neil passes these steps carefully and well. Their new child is just born. Neil finds friends among those people and these relationships reach the level of family and everything goes well. At the same time, the news is published that Russia has made an astronaut suit to be in the outer space of the spacecraft and has tested it, which means they also have plans to step on the moon or beyond. The Gemini project has reached test number 5. The year 1965 is when this spaceship will be launched. But Neil will not be among the astronauts of this test. At the same time, Dick Slayton informs Neil that he is going to be the commander of Gemini 8 and Dave Scott will be his pilot. Gemini 8 project is a project that is supposed to connect Gemini to Agena, that's why it's a very important project. Before starting this project, Neil is informed that Elliot, a friend who was even his neighbor, was on a flight and the plane crashed and he died. This incident is difficult and painful for Neil and his colleagues. The launch day arrives. All the steps are checked and the launch is successful. Gemini 8 and Neil Armstrong reach outer space. All this time, they gave his wife a radio line to keep her informed of all the steps that are taking place for Neil. Now Neil has to get Gemini 8 to Agena and connect with it. They don't find Agena's spacecraft, that's why Neil starts moving Gemini 8 until they finally find Agena. They reach Agena and successfully connect Gemini 8 to Agena. This is a big event for NASA and the project to reach the surface of the moon, and Neil was part of this project. After a while after this connection, the balance of the spaceship is suddenly disturbed and it starts to spin violently. This rotation is so much that the pilot with him faints. Neil decides to separate Gemini 8 from Agena to save it. During these emergency conditions, Janet's radio communication is turned off, and this causes her to personally go to the project site on the ground and ask them to explain the conditions exactly to her and reconnect the radio communication. At the last moment, Neil can restore the balance of Gemini 8. After a while, the pilot with him regains consciousness. And finally they return to the ground. In the meeting after Neil's return, they ask him about the decision he made to separate from Agena, and the reporters ask various questions about that moment of turning and, finally, whether doing these missions is worth wasting life and money. Neil listens to all these words and thinks about it. These conditions make Neil a little nervous and withdrawn towards his family. He feels defeated and is looking for a way to escape from it. But when he realizes that the time has finally come for the Apollo 1 test and his friends are going to do this test, and on the other hand, they have chosen Neil as their representative in the ceremony held in the White House, it makes him feel better and he starts seriously again. His work will return, and during this time his relationship with his family will improve again. The time for the Apollo 1 test arrives. At this time Neil and his team are present in the White House. Before the start of the test, oxygen leaks inside the chamber and immediately causes an explosion and kills all 3 astronauts and Neil's close friends. They secretly deliver this news to Neil and ask him to stay there without anyone knowing anything until they come after them. This was another sad news for Neil. But he knows that he has no choice but to continue, especially after all the cost of lives for this project. In 1968, Neil is practicing the various stages of this project, and although he fails many times, he is confident that this should happen. In this situation, people protesting the implementation of these projects start protesting everywhere in America. That they shouldn't spend the money on the cost of these works while there's still poverty and many other problems in the country. These public and even political pressures make some people doubt the continuation of the project, but Neil believes that they should continue. After all these tests, it has been decided that Apollo 11 will be the mission to land on the moon, and they want to give command of this operation to Neil. After the Apollo 11 pre-launch press conference, when Neil is packing up to go to the launch site, Janet asks him to talk to their sons himself about where he is going and what might happen to him, because she isn't responsible to answer the boys' questions if Neil doesn't come back. All the family members sit around the table and Neil tries to explain this project to them in a way that is understandable for his sons and doesn't cause them anxiety and worry, and even says that he may never come back. Neil Armstrong and Edwin Aldrin are the people who are in Apollo 11 as astronauts, and everything is ready for them to step on the moon. Cape Kennedy, Florida, July 16, 1969 is the time and place of the launch of Apollo 11 from the surface of the Earth. The time comes and the launch is successful, and after a while they leave the atmosphere. They can attach themselves to the mother spacecraft to go to the moon. They study the conditions of landing on the moon, and by controlling all the steps, they can separate from the mother spacecraft and land on the moon. Neil and Aldrin are the first humans to set foot on the moon, and the strangest possible picture is that they look at the Earth from there. They take samples from the soil of the moon's surface and return to their own ship, and then get back connection to the mother ship and reach the ground level successfully. Their names remained forever in history: Neil Armstrong and Edwin Aldrin, the first men on the moon.